All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tiffany Brown, and I'm the CEO and founder of Gillis Education. And I will be, moderating and leading this talk or this conversation today. I do want to, as always, encourage everyone to send in questions on the chat and talk to us on Twitter, even on Instagram if you want to, DM us.
Yeah.
This is an interactive space for everyone to participate. So I just want to encourage you to actually take the offer. So today, in honor of the Juneteenth holiday, which is now a federal holiday,
Woohoo.
but has been celebrated. Yes, thank you, Biden. Has been celebrated since June 19th of 1865. I thought it would be a great time to actually just take a moment to, one, celebrate how far we've come from that day in 1865 with regards to pursuing equality and pursuing equity in the United States, but also acknowledging that we have a long way to go to reach the ideal. And I know that I didn't know much about the Juneteenth holiday growing up. It's the holiday that celebrates the day that freedom soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas to read that famous General Order Number 3 that informed formerly enslaved Blacks that they were indeed free. Um, and their freedom involved an absolute equality of personal rights and personal property. And that's a quote. Um, and so I think that this important day in 1865, Juneteenth, marked a time when the country really began to take baby steps, baby steps in the right direction when it came to civil rights and civil liberties. Obviously, there was a lot of thwarting of that progress over the years and still today, which we'll get into. But it was an important moment in Black history and in American history. And so thinking about the significance of Juneteenth today in 2023, I think it's a good time to reflect on the fact that the preservation of history and of Black history as American history is so important. And Black history is intricately interwoven in the fabric of our nation's founding. And in today's political and social climate, which is a little crazy right now, it's critical that we remember the importance of knowing our history, especially as we teach our young people about the world around them. And it's important that we give them that context about why things are the way that they are so that they can go out and be productive policymakers, doctors, lawyers, educators, engineers, and so on, that they understand the history and the roots of our country so that they can do those things without, there's always going to be bias, but without as much bias as possible. So all of that is to say that efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are very much needed still today. And so with that introduction, today's talk is called We Belong, a conversation on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in education. And I am honored to be joined by Dr. Deonna Smith of Deonna Smith Consulting. She is a former educator, a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, and recently received her doctoral degree from Loyola Marymount University in educational leadership for social justice. She's the author of a new book titled Rooted in Joy, Creating a Classroom Culture of Equity, Belonging, and Care. Hi, Deonna. That was a long introduction, but thank you
Thank you
for
so
being.
much for introducing me.
Yes, no problem. And I know that I just touched the surface of who you are and your journey in education and your journey to becoming a DEIB expert. And so I'll let you, take the mic and tell us about your journey in education and even your upbringing and how you've gotten to where you are today.
Yeah. Yes, thank you again for having me. I'm so excited to be in community with you this afternoon. To get started, I guess, just to start with my own educational experience, I'm from Spokane, Washington, a very, very homogenous town and area. And I grew up as being the only person of color at the elementary school I went to, the only person of color in many of my classes throughout my academic career. I actually didn't even have a Black teacher until my doctoral program a few short years ago. So I grew up very much somebody who did not experience that sense of belonging in my educational experience. And part of that is, of course, what motivated me to eventually seek out this journey to become a teacher, a school leader, and now a teacher coach, educational consultant. So it really is all of that is kind of the seed which sprouted all of this work. Had wonderful teachers. They were well trained. They did not know what it meant to have a Black student, though. So I worked with a lot of folks that were technically really good teachers, but just didn't understand the weight of making a person who looked like me belong in that very PWI white space. So that was really tricky. And then as I grew and I started to think about like what I wanted to do, I really thought about being that teacher that I would have needed at that time. Like how could I have shown up for my former self? And I started teaching elementary school. I taught elementary school, middle school. I worked with everything from kinder to high school, as a diversity, equity, inclusion lead, as a teacher coach, a school vice principal. So I've had a lot of different hats in the school building. But as I've continued to grow and just deepen my connection with different school communities, learning more about the craft, what has continued to really be the cornerstone of my work is this emphasis on making sure that our kids are safe and joyful and feel like they belong in these classroom spaces. So that's a little bit about my why and my process. And now I'm grateful to work with teachers really all across the country doing the same thing that are just equally yoked in that mission.
Great, and that's really helpful. I feel like we had opposite experiences almost. I grew up in a place that, very Black, and actually a lot of my teachers were white. I did have a lot of white teachers, but I also had a good number of Black teachers as well. So it wasn't until college and law school where it was completely different, where I went to PWIs and was sometimes the only person sitting in the room, only Black person, I'm sorry, only Black person sitting in the room, certainly only the Black woman in a lot of these spaces, but also not actually seeing, and I may have had one or two Black professors during my time in undergrad. And I think I could really count on, yeah, only about two Black professors in law school. Again, might have been the courses I was taking, but it's interesting. And this question of belonging and diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of that didn't really hit home for me until I actually was confronted with being the only one in those spaces. And so we know also that, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis back in May of 2020 really sparked a number of protests across the country. And it really shed light on the ways that public and private institutions structurally discriminate against Black people and other people of colors, and the LGBTQI plus community. It shed light on all of that, all of this systemic discrimination. And after that huge moment, newsworthy moment, DE&I kind of became a buzzword, and not to say that it didn't exist already, it existed, but it became popularized after the murder of George Floyd. Again, even though the concepts were not new and the terms weren't new, but we all of a sudden heard a lot about DE&I and anti-racism and all of that. And so I want to pause just to get kind of like a definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Like, what does that mean? And what is it, as a D&I consultant, what do you actually do in the classroom?
Yeah. And I think it's so important what you said about how the events of 2020 catapulted all of this into the common lexicon,
Right.
but we were having these conversations long before any of this was going on. So it was a thing. It was just, this was really the moment where we all were like, okay, we can't ignore this anymore.
Right.
And so I think it kind of in that wake, it almost became like alphabet soup. Like everybody was like, what do, like, okay, we need a DEI. Like, oh, it needs to be justice. It needs to be belonging. Like, no, it's anti-racist, but we're banning anti-racism. So
Right.
in a lot of ways, like a lot of the work is similar, but there are some important distinctions because sometimes schools will talk about diversity, and you very well may have diversity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a culture of belonging. And you very well may have, inclusion, but that doesn't mean that you have a culture of equity. And you could be, you could be talking about anti-LGBT issues and helping people unpack sexism or xenophobia, but that doesn't mean that you're actively combating anti-blackness. And so I think it's important to note that all of these things are slightly different. So me personally, like at my most essential, I would describe myself as, an abolitionist, because I really believe in the legacy of the work that stems from people like Angela Davis, Robin Kelly, those abolitionists that believe that our system is so fundamentally rooted in these things that they need to be not just reformed, but all the way broken down and rebuilt again. So I'm a believer in like abolition in the way that people would think about like abolishing the slave trade. Like
Right.
I believe the same thing about education. So I would say that's on like the furthest end, but then more encompassing. And I broadly refer to them as asset pedagogies. And they're all just pedagogical practices that really position ourselves with thinking, what if the problem isn't the kids? What if the problem is the systems? And so, like, with that, you have things like diversity, which is maybe the lightest, kind of easiest thing to jump into, which means like different people are in the room, different ideas are being shared, different perspectives are being heard. And then you get into like belonging, which is more like, okay, but do those people have a sense of agency and belonging, and are they welcomed? There's things like inclusion, like everybody's in the room, but are we inviting them to the conversation? Do they have time to talk on the agenda? And
Mm.
then we think about things like equity, which is a little bit more deeper. Now, if you have like equity, that's a great place to start because things like diversity and inclusion will bloom from that. So if you think about equity, equity is really breaking down the systems, the practices, the policies that are at play that are keeping these spaces the way that they are, which is a vestige of white supremacy culture. So if you start with like the deepest work, I think that you'll get to the lighter stuff naturally. But unfortunately, what happens is so many people start with just diversity and then they stop right there. They say like, oh, my best friend is black. I know tons of black people. Like we've got a black HR rep. And then you kind of stop there. So it's important to note that all of these things, all of these words are different. They do mean something, but collectively, they're really in the same, I think, ideological camp, especially when I work with people that are in the world of education. We talk about asset pedagogies, but there's a broad spectrum between like, I think there should be more Black and Brown teachers, diversity, or like we have to think about why our systems produce these results that there are so few Black and Brown teachers. Like, what are we doing in the system, right? That's more like equity. To the way that we do schooling probably should just be rethought in the first place. Like even the whole institution of school, which is more of an abolition question. So there's kind of a continuum there. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very helpful, especially your point about starting with the equity. I think that we could probably all think of examples since 2020 of like even in our workspaces where someone has kind of just been plopped into a position or, and they're like, okay, this is the diversity person.
Yep.
And
Fix all the problems now.
right, exactly. Okay, we've checked the box. That's good. Now we're like, doing the DEI thing. Even like with implicit bias trainings and things like that, I've actually personally had like really great experiences, I believe, with like implicit bias trainings. But like you said, there has to be a lot of real hard work done to dismantle what has been created over the years, the hundreds of years that our country was founded. So I love how you broke that down, and the belonging piece as well. We can't just change the policies and say, okay, we're done, or put somebody in a position and say, all right, we're diverse now. You actually really need to take that a step further and make it feel as though people are, and actually not just feel that they do indeed
Right.
belong, that they feel a sense of belonging and that they actually are, that they actually do belong. So I love how you broke that down. Um, and so again, kind of jumping back to the Juneteenth holiday and celebrating it, um, and not knowing that much about the holiday growing up, um, how should schools in this environment implement anti-racist and inclusive teaching practices in light of all of the anti-DNI efforts that are going on? So we have a group of people that think that this is just, it's almost like reverse discrimination. Like they are not okay with it. And we'll get to the book bans in a moment, but how should schools go about choosing and implementing anti-racist curricula?
Yeah. Choosing and implementing, those are kind of two different beasts. But I think just a broad question when you think about curriculum practices, and I always say like a curriculum is only as anti-racist as the teacher that's delivering it. So if you're taking on this work, you want to think about your curriculum, your policies, like all of that stuff kind of goes into it together. Because what I also see schools do from time to time is they see a good curriculum that's solid and vetted, and then they're like, okay, we're doing it, like, but there's so much that goes into it. So I would say like one thing to think about is that and I say this, because I don't want anybody to lose their jobs, but you just because these things are equity-based practices, it doesn't mean that it's also not just good teaching. I mean, this all comes from like Gloria Ladson Billings and her like breakthrough article, which is
Right.
that's just good teaching. These are just good practices. Like I think we kind of lose sight of that because people think there's like best teaching practices and then there's equitable teaching practices or anti-racist teaching practices. They're the same. So when you actually look into what these curriculums are doing or what these practices are, you'll see that like, oh, this is just like really good ways of being with students and in community with people. So take the pressure off yourself with that, of realizing like you're actually helping like not just your Black and brown students, but all of your students, because these are just good teaching practices. So there's that. And then I know a lot of teachers, they do these practices, they just don't call them that. And that's
Right.
okay. I mean, it's great to be able to say it, but if you're in a rural area where, you can't tell anybody what you're doing, I'm not going to tell if you're not going to tell, right? Just implement it, call it something else, call it a community builder and keep it pushing is what I
Right.
say, because it doesn't have to. I mean, this whole thing about the labels and stuff is just utterly ridiculous. And so any way to subvert that we can, I say go for it. As far as when you're thinking about like how to implement and what to implement, it really starts with asking yourself like, how are you willing to see this as a commitment that's going to take time and resources? Because it's not going to be just an add-on. It's not going to be like a fun little extra thing that you're going to be able to do. I mean, schools have amazing amount of resources, but for some reason, when it comes to equity work, our wallets just get so tight. Like they just and it's like, oh, we don't have time to, give the teachers an hour to do this, or like we couldn't possibly fit it into the schedule here. So the reality is, for it to be done well, it's going to take time and money. Like that's just how it is. So you have to be willing, pretend it's, a standardized test thing. We'll make time for that, but we won't make time for these belonging initiatives. So I think that's really something that you want to think about, is the gravity and the commitment that you need to make. And another piece that's important, and it kind of goes along with this message of Juneteenth, is sometimes when I work with schools, especially schools that their heart's in the right place. Like they really want to be anti-racist. They're like, we want to do this work. We want to dig in. They forget that there's more to people who have been marginalized than our stories of oppression. Like they only want to talk about Japanese internment camps, slavery, the Holocaust. Like they only want to talk about the negative things. But I always tell them, like, those things are not really our history. That's white history. Like Black history, slavery is not Black history. Slavery is something in the transatlantic slave trade, at least, is 100% white history. That is a very European project that they put into place there. So it's really important when you're thinking about jumping into this work. In the spirit of Juneteenth, it's not all strife and struggle, right? You have to balance it and recognize, like, you're not just telling the stories of how Black people have fit into the overall scope of white history. You're instead telling stories of joy, of resistance, of, just Black excellence that have existed, but we've just chosen not to teach them. So you really have to totally reframe the way that you engage with understanding other people's stories if you want to jump into this work meaningfully. So that's just something that I always pose to people to think about as a consideration.
Right. And this is just out of curiosity. So when you're working with schools, are they, or in educators and administrators, do they have like assigned reading? Like, do they have to go and read like the 1619 Project or like other projects? I'm sorry, other books that talk about anti-racism and the history of Blacks in America?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm a huge book person, big
Right.
fan. So, and one of those things, as I get deeper into this work, when my book drops on August 8th, that'll be one of the required readings, is my book, of course. But I do have a lot of different resources and just, articles, books that I think help people reframe the way that they approach this work. Because again, you're only as anti-racist as the curriculum is only as anti-racist as the person implementing it. So there are things that I think that we can just do as people. And I think, and sometimes people, I get pushback because they're like, well, we also have to talk about LGBTQ or gender, etc. But once we start with one intersection of identity, once those muscles turn on, once those frameworks are frameworking in your brain, it's so much easier to understand all the different intersections of identity. So anything that we go through that talks about anti-racism, you're going to be able to say, like, oh, now that critical lens is on, and now I get it when I'm talking about this other issue. So it's not to say that we begin and end with anti-racism. There's a lot more to it, but because there's such a wealth of knowledge and it's such a clear story that we can tell and understand, and because Black people, regardless of whatever other intersections, are usually at the farthest margin of whatever other intersection they're at, it makes sense to start there. And so once those frameworks are turned on, you just begin to see everything differently. It helps you become a better teacher, helps you become a better leader, because you're using, those critical thinking skills that we love to talk about in the standards, but we don't necessarily use when we're talking about how we're teaching.
Right. And I want to emphasize too, that's a great explanation of intersectionality and like where to start and why we start with, race and with Black history. But I do want to make that point and underscore that this work is for everyone. So in a recent training that I attended, the leader, the trainer said, if you're breathing, if you're a human, this training is for you because you have biases. Doesn't matter if you're a Black woman, doesn't matter if you identify as, a lesbian or whatever. If you are a human and you are breathing and you woke up this morning, you have certain biases inherently. Yeah. And so this DEIB, anti-racist, whatever the term you want to use, all of that work is for all of us. And I will say, I guess, are there, and I'm sure there are, but age-appropriate strategies for implementing curricula? I know that, one concern with bringing in certain texts and things like that is oh, they're too young to talk about those sorts of things, or, this is going to hurt their feelings or make them feel isolated, or, uh, what sort of age appropriate considerations are there when you're doing this work?
Yeah, and I think it's a huge misconception that there's something about a 5-year-old or a 3-year-old that they don't understand race, because we actually, like, science tells us that kids as young as 4 years old start to pick their playmates based on race.
Mm.
Infants show preference based on race, like they're more comfortable with people that are the same race as the people in their immediate social circles. And by the end of kindergarten, kids have internalized messages about race. And so this is like empirical scientific data, but also Black and brown kids experience race, from the, if you understand epigenetics, you understand that from before you are even in like the womb, before you are even growing fingernails and eyelashes and toes in your mother's uterus, you are experiencing racism, because epigenetically we know that, like, those telomeres and the cortisol levels and all of these factors that change the cell biology of Black people because of racism, those are in place when your mother is in the womb. So you are experiencing racism before you're even conceived of, right? And we know that there was a perfect example just recently. A former Olympian died during childbirth. We know that
I saw that.
Right.
Yes.
Black
Yes.
women are 10 times more likely than white women in the United States to die during childbirth. Black babies have asthma more often. They're more delivered via cesarean. I mean, we are experiencing the outcomes of racism before we draw breath. So it's always happening. So if we're old enough to experience it, those kids are old enough to learn about it. And there are definitely age appropriate ways and strategies. And they start with really easy things and fun things like exposure. The best thing you can do when, I have a lot of family that'll ask me, like, especially white folks will ask, well, how do I, like, make sure my kid isn't racist? And I'm like, okay, well, who are your kids' playmates? Who do they grow up with? Who do they see? That's a really low risk way to help your kid understand that there are other races and ways of being. Take your kid to a street fair. Take your kid to a culture festival. There's this great company called Kiwi Crate, and they make these little crates, and each month you get like a different country around the world. All of those little things, those are fun things. That's not going to traumatize a child, right? These are really easy things that you could do for our littlest learners. Bringing in books, picture books, different stories of other people, exposing them about the different people that are in the world, helping them build that lens of empathy. And then a huge thing is your own education, because as a parent, whether you know it or not, your kid is taking its cues from you. So if your kid sees you and your bias showing up, if your kid sees you get scared every time a Black person walks by your car door, or if your kid hears you talking about how Latino people are taking jobs in this country, or if your kid hears you, saying that trans people shouldn't be in the bathroom,
Right.
that's what they're going to absorb. So if you're really thinking about that, they're watching how you react as well. That's our first teacher. Parents are the first teacher. So I would say, like,
And if they see you without Black friends or
right.
diverse group of friends.
If they see you with all white friends, and then you're insisting to them that, like, it's good to have different types of friends, that there's also empirical research that shows that kids pay attention to what we do more than what we say.
Absolutely.
So those are little easy ways, very low stakes ways that you can start the conversation. And then teachers, there are no shortage of books and activities that are targeted towards our littlest learners that help them understand that the world is an inequitable place. But what's also true about all of those resources is they always include a level of agency. They always include and you can make it a better place. I mean, it's the same thing. We talk to kids a lot about environmentalism. If kids these days, usually they'll learn about, like, sorting their recyclables, and no one's scared that they're traumatizing the kids by learning about climate change. Like, we're very open about telling the kids that, yeah, the climate is going haywire and the earth is in trouble. But we also, like, teach them how they can be a part of helping, like, don't be a litter bug and all of these fun things. So if we can do, I think that's a great model of understanding how you can take an issue that's a big issue, that's really an adult issue that we created, but scale it down and make it fun and engaging for kids to learn about, and then give them a sense of agency. So there's a lot of examples out there. It's just like a myth that needs to be busted, that you're going to traumatize kids by teaching them about race, really.
Right. Right. Yeah, and on that topic of books, right? The book bans that are going on right now. That's another thing that's that ticked up after George Floyd's murder, Ahmaud Arbery's murder, Breonna Taylor. Right? We had that. 2020 was a big year for the Black
Yes.
Lives Matter movement, and there, were a significant increase in requests by public school teachers for books by or about African Americans, and also Latino, Asian, Muslim, Jewish cultures. There was this increase in requests for books about diverse sets of people. And it's indicative of, that desire to have more inclusive curricula be implemented in schools. But we have anti-student inclusion efforts running rampant now across the country. Organizations, politicians, individual parents, they're
Yeah.
using parents' rights as a springboard for banning diverse books from classrooms and from libraries. And we know all about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's
Oh, girl.
signing. Yeah.
Why? He's
I
got to
know
go.
yeah, it's a whole thing in Florida. He signed the Florida Parental Rights and Education Act, more commonly known as the Don't Say Gay law, which built on the existing 2021 Florida's Parents Bill of Rights. And then we have another group, Moms for Liberty, and its associated political action committee that's become really powerful in pushing these anti-student inclusion efforts. And it was founded in 2021. So it's like this backlash
Yeah.
to the Black Lives Matter movement. And just recently, a Moms for Liberty chapter in Tennessee filed a complaint under the state's new anti-critical race theory law, claiming that some books taught in schools, books like Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington, books like Ruby Bridges' autobiography, they complained that they were anti-American and anti-white. So there is this effort to get diverse books out of the classrooms in order to protect to protect white students, right? To protect certain populations. And so can you talk about why, in your eyes, as a DE&I expert and as a former educator, and based on like what we've been talking about, for the past 20 minutes or so, why are these book bans so dangerous? And secondly, what can parents and community members do to counteract these book bans if they pop up in their area?
Yeah. Well, first, I guess the first thing I'll do is really answer the second question, which is, what can you do? Because I want everybody to note how expeditiously these things were able to happen. I mean, it was record time from the inception of this idea that these books are harmful to them actually being banned. To, I have some teacher friends in Florida, they have to pack up their libraries and get them approved by like a media specialist. Like they have to ship all of their books to an external person to approve every single book in their library.
Wow.
We're talking about a 12-month turnaround at that. Now, mind you, in 2020, people were out there in the streets protesting for something much more urgent, which is, for Black people to stop being killed by the police. And we were told that these things take time. There's a process. There's a right way to do it. So if we can learn anything, it's that these people know how to organize.
Yeah.
One thing they gonna do is organize, get together, and get something passed expeditiously. So for me, when I see that, I'm like, okay, so we know that it can be done, because that's that, but we need that energy, and that energy is just, it doesn't exist on the other side. So it's really important for people to understand. I don't want to hear anything about we don't know what to do, this doesn't work. What works is showing up to school board meetings over and over again, being persistent. That's what our democracy was founded on. We've really, strayed from that light. But if you think about it, the essence of it is that, it's a democracy. People can participate. So, what families can do is we need you to be louder than the Moms for Liberty. We need people to be louder than, we should. So, I'm in California, and I like to think of like, DeSantis's nemesis is kind of Gavin Newsom in a lot of ways, right? So, so I need people like, okay, if Florida's going to be doing that, California needs to be having something just as aggressive, or New York needs to be, or Washington, in the opposite direction, because it can move that fast. So what I'm trying to really communicate to people is we don't have to be like shocked and like confused. We need to just beat them at their own game. Their game is foot traffic, grassroots movements. A lot of these start off as one county issues. You're talking about one county of people that get it together quickly enough, and then the rest of the counties kind of follow suit. And you'll notice it starts in the smaller counties in Florida. It doesn't start in big places like Miami-Dade County, right? It starts in these like little small random locations, or like the small places in Tennessee, and then it kind of picks up wind.
Right.
Okay, great. Then that's the way that we need to move. So I don't think that this is something that we cannot advocate and organize against. What I think the reason why it's so important to people, and I don't think that they really care about those little white kids' feelings. I don't really think it's about that. It's about something much bigger. Because if it was really just about the kids' feelings and how kids were feeling in classrooms, we would have a lot more resources for social emotional health. If we were really concerned about how kids were feeling and doing, we would be funding programs to make sure that kids are feeling and doing okay. But we know we also don't do that. So it's really a clear movement that is set to reconstruct like our concept of civil rights. It's much more insidious than that. And I'm going to sound a little conspiracy theory right now, so walk with me here though. But that's what when a lot of societies are really trying to create an intergenerational change, they start with education.
Right.
So really the risk isn't that we're going to have kids who the goal isn't that white kids don't feel bad about Jim Crow. The goal is that an entire generation doesn't really understand that Jim Crow was about racism. In the same way that, like, when I went to school, it was like, was the Civil War about slaves, or was it about states' rights? But they retconned that. They kind of changed the narrative on that. They kind of switched it around. And I'm sure at the beginning, people were teaching slavery about being what it was about, teaching the Civil War about being about slavery. But there's these organizations that are in charge of the curricular decisions that have kind of slowly rewrote the narrative. And now we have people in 2023 that don't even really understand the horrors of slavery because they've been written out of the textbooks. There was a textbook, I don't want to name names, but it was one of the big ones that changed it from like slavery to like indentured worker, like all of these like little all of that slick stuff is to create the next generation where, of course, these kids aren't going to think that reparations are necessary, or affirmative action is necessary, or implicit bias is necessary, because they're not going to know that racism was about racism. They're going to think it was just Black people and white people were kind of mad at each other for a few years, and both sides did some bad things, but now we all get along. So it's really not about making kids feel bad. It is a deliberate effort to reconstitute the way that we understand race in this country. And it is because whiteness was being not even under attack, because we weren't even in a position to attack whiteness because we didn't have any institutional power and still don't. But whiteness as a concept in this country was called into the light. Like, we were talking about it in a way that we never had. And so the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen again is to not teach people about it. So it is much more than a couple of moms that don't want to talk about Ruby Bridges. It is a concentrated, very well organized effort to change the way that we teach reality in this country. And it really can't be overstated how important it is that we do something about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is such a good point. It is definitely more insidious than that, right? It is the ultimate threat to our democracy.
Yeah.
And that sounds, really dramatic, but it is. And the ability of those groups to mobilize, you are so right about, let's take notes. Let's actually,
They are efficient.
they are efficient. I mean, they move quickly and, swiftly, and it has caught fire. I mean, I just put up on the screen a stat that so far in 2023, 35 bills to actually ban D&I in state university systems have been introduced in 20 state legislatures, and a lot of those are have provisions that also trickle down to the K through 12 system. And so it's a great point about how fast they moved, how well they were able to mobilize, and look at the progress over the last 2 years. Progress that is actually not good.
Regression. Yeah, regression. The progress that they've regressed. Yeah.
Exactly, regression. And we do know that, the White House and the Biden administration has signaled that, they are going to be combating these efforts. They just released a fact sheet that specifically expressed the need to shield LGBTQI plus Americans from book bans that threaten their rights. And they announced that the Department of Education will actually appoint a new coordinator to address, the growing threat of book bans that, pose civil rights issues for students. So there are efforts to combat these book bans, but it is something that, again, we should all be paying very close attention to and mobilizing in the opposite way. Continuing to actually give books that are diverse and give books that are inclusive, and make sure that, as parents, we have those right in our home as well.
Mhm.
Part of Gillis Education's philosophy is, that we are our children's first teachers. And yes, we want to work with educators and the schools and administrators and, to make sure that the education system, the formal education system, is the best that it can possibly be. But as parents, we also have a duty to make sure that our books at home are inclusive and that we are consistently feeding our kids knowledge and spending that time with them to talk about these issues at an age appropriate level, like we were talking about earlier. And so, to the point about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs being at risk now and being thrown out, uh, we have an important decision coming up soon about affirmative action. And affirmative action was a necessary antidote to systemic, entrenched, legal, racial discrimination. And so, over the last 50 years, affirmative action policies have been litigated in the courts, since 1978. And the litigation has centered on affirmative action policies in education. But those decisions, have gone into, trickled into other sectors like employment and all of that. And the 2003 decision actually told, you know, schools, hey, you don't need to necessarily throw out your affirmative action policies, but you might want to consider lightening up on your consideration of race when making admissions decisions. And so the consequence of that decision, and that was the Grutter decision, over the last 2 decades, since 2003, we've seen a slow chipping away of affirmative action policies in higher education. And I'll have a future event on the breakdown of the legal history of affirmative action policies in the US. But soon, very soon, the Supreme Court will let us know whether affirmative action policies will be completely overturned, and they'll let us know if the very idea of considering race is quote unquote racist. Um, and so, again, affirmative action was an antidote to systemic racism. And a lot of people are saying, oh, yeah, we don't need that anymore. We don't need affirmative action policies, or affirmative action policies are racist because we are giving, certain groups of people a leg up, and they don't need that. It's 2023. So, what
Right.
are your thoughts on affirmative action, and especially as it relates to actually needing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in our schools?
Yeah. Oh, so many thoughts. This is such an important topic. And it kind of connects to what I was just saying about how we tell stories, how we teach history, right? Because you have to understand that affirmative action didn't just come from, you know what this place needs? More Black people. Like it wasn't just a thing where people were like, oh, I feel like we should have more Black people today. It's similar to reparations in that you have to understand that we were robbed. So you have to like get it that it's righting a wrong. It's not really like a policy that is like they just came up with to get more Black people. It was to right a historical wrong. So when you think about it as a corrective action, as opposed to just a liberal progressive, like let's get more Black people in here, it's not really that. It's an acknowledgement that Black people were robbed of these spots that they should have had in the first place. And it's the same thing with reparations. Reparations is not there. Every Black person needs $100 because we're doing so poorly financially. It is Black people were robbed for 400 years. So if anything, we're paying a debt. We're collecting on the debt. There's an educational debt, right? That's how Gloria Ladson-Billing is conceptualized, educational debt. So Black and Brown people were robbed in this country for generations. And affirmative action was one way that we recognize that, like, there's no way that we can correct that robbery unless we're intentional about it now, because we're low-key still robbing them. So that's the thing about affirmative action too, is I want people to really look at the numbers and disaggregate the numbers. Don't just look at how many people of color. It's not just people of color, okay? Because there's a difference between being a Black person and a person of color, okay? So keep that in mind. It's not just how many people of color get a higher education degree. It's how many Black people are in these spaces, or how many Indigenous folks are in these spaces. Those are the numbers that I'm really trying to see. If you look at elite universities like Harvard, or even if you look at, I'm in California, right? We have the UC system. California is one of the most diverse states, except at the collegiate level, at the UC Berkeley's, at the UCLA's. Those are still PWIs, and yet we're in California. So it's those kinds of questions that you need to look at, because I think people are thinking that affirmative action means that, it's going to just be a wave of Black people, which to me, that's ain't nothing wrong with that to me, but I understand that scares people. And B, affirmative action doesn't mean that I can get a B and then you get an A, but I get in because I'm Black. And I think we just have to let that myth go. Affirmative action is just a recognition that, like, the playing field is not even. It's not even to begin with. Here's another example. Okay, I got my master's at Notre Dame. A lot of the people that I went to school with were legacy students, right? Almost 50% of Notre Dame students are legacy, which means that they have a parent that went to Notre Dame. Well, let's think about this. Women couldn't even go to Notre Dame until like the 80s, and Black people couldn't go to Notre Dame until like the 70s. So how is it a level playing field if you can get in because your grandpa went here, but when my grandpa was going to college, my grandpa didn't go to college, but let's say that he did, he certainly wouldn't be able to go to Notre Dame. So it's not saying that all of a sudden we need to pick all of the and I think that's a problematic notion, but I think people think you're picking like underachieving Black and Brown people to take high achieving white spots. That's not really it. It's acknowledging that things like legacies, things like having generations upon generations of people that were homeowners or that went to college, that means that the playing field is not equal. And so if we just cream the top and we pretend like the playing field is equal, we're not going to have equity. We're going to have equality, but not equity. And I think that people also need to acknowledge that you bring something to the table, like having a different experience, experiencing life as a Black person in this country. There's value in that. And I think that's something that we need to be okay with saying, like, oh, what if it is? What if I am bringing something just because I'm Black, because I have a different experience? That's okay too. So I think that this misconception about what affirmative action is and where it comes from is really at the root of this fear. I think that affirmative action is also being used as a tool of white supremacy culture to further divide people of color. So, for example, you had that Asian student who was talking about how he got like a perfect score on an SAT, but like didn't get into, I don't know, Yale or Harvard, something like that, and blamed Black people. And that's one way to do it. Or is it to say for Black people and Asian people to say, why are we fighting over one spot when white people have 20 spots? Like, does
Right.
it make sense? Am I the reason you didn't get in? Or are all of the other white people whose parents are making gigantic donations, whose great grandparents went here, and whose, moms are in the PTA clubs, is that the reason why you didn't get in here? But it's used as a tool to divide people. It's also used as a tool to drive a wedge between white women and people of color. Because actually, if you look at the data, the people that have been most benefited by affirmative action are actually white women. But when we talk about affirmative action in terms of race and culture, it's used as a device to kind of stir up this, like, well, what about white women? We have systemic challenges too. And no one's saying that you don't. But I'm not arguing with a white woman over 5 spots when white men have 40 spots. That's just not really worth my time. So I think it's really important for people to understand, like, affirmative action is righting a wrong, a historical educational debt of acknowledging that people of color have been locked out of these positions and regulated to, historically Black colleges and universities, which are underfunded, right? So sometimes people will say, like, well, then why don't you just go to an all Black college? Well, what they don't tell you is the way that student loan debt is set up in this country. If you go to those like historically Black colleges, you usually, end up in a ton of debt. And so you might have other considerations. There's so much that go into it, more than just taking an average Black student over a high achieving white student. But because we allow it to become a weapon and we aren't really researching what it means and how it works, it's an easy target for people to stir up that division, which further divides communities of color. Like I was talking about, it divides white women from people of color, and it obscures the fact that, again, it's a historical debt.
Right. That's so well put. And yes, there's, a long history of that pitting minorities against one another. And it is a tool. It's a tool. And so we'll circle back after this Supreme Court makes its decision. Yes. And, we'll see what comes of it. But we know, even, from the data, there was a recent study out of Georgetown University on race considered admissions in higher education. And the study found that ending affirmative action policies would really threaten and bring down all the progress that has been made in student diversity. Because a lot of people also say, oh, well, there are other ways to, bring diversity to campus. And it's like, yeah, but, this is one of them. Right. Addressing admissions is a huge one. And if we take that out of the equation, it will lead to less diverse populations. And so shifting gears to your book and Deonna Smith Consulting, let's start with your book. Can you talk about your book, Rooted in Joy, that's coming out soon?
Yes, and I don't have a copy yet to show you, but imagine it here. And it's really it's a book for educational stakeholders who want to dive into this work, but want to do it in a way that really centers and is rooted in joy, hence the title. Kind of like what I was discussing before when I talked about how anti-racist work, culturally responsive work, DEI work doesn't always have to just be caught up in the strife and struggle, but rather using joy, rest as a tool of liberation to really unlock our students' full potentials. So it's not about all the ways that our students are lacking. It's about how our classrooms can be spaces where their inherent greatness and wonderfulness can be unleashed and really have, kind of free reign. So it's a book for people, in education. Also, I think families and caregivers can get a lot out of it. But it really started with my experience over, a decade of working in the classroom and in the school building, and really noticing that there was a gap in the literature when it came to classroom culture specifically. There's more stuff about like curriculum and like instructional methods, but there's not as much about how our classroom culture and how we handle behavior and how we build community needs a little bit of a refresh in the light of what we now know and understand about bias, diversity, equity, and care. So it is really a love letter to that community. It is a field guide. It's very practice heavy, because I remember being a teacher and reading stuff and being like, okay, that's nice. Like, that's cool. But like, how do I actually do it? So
Right.
I wanted to make sure there was lots of that. So that's a little bit about Rooted in Joy. Yeah.
That's great. And so I'm sorry, you mentioned it's coming out in August?
Yes, August 8th.
August 8th. Okay. So we will mark our calendars, but folks can pre-order it, right?
They can. And if you pre-order, you get access to a like more tactical workshop. So even more on how to implement the book. Because like I said, I had this like goal. I was like, I don't want anybody to read this and be like, okay, so what do I do? So if you pre-order, you get access to that workshop as well. It's about an hour of more tools and how to really put the work to work in the
Right.
classroom.
Right. And, Gillis Education is first and foremost a tutoring company. We offer tutoring and academic coaching, but we are, educators, not educators uh, in the normal sense, but we work with students every day and individually, small groups during workshops. And so I'm excited to order it and actually read it and get my hands on it, because I'm sure that some of the principles are going to be applicable to how we actually relate and create lesson plans and do activities and develop curricula for our students that we're working with outside of the classroom. So I'm really excited to actually get my hands on it. And also, just to, kind of end on, I know we've talked about book bans and affirmative action
Oh,
and racism and all of these things, just to kind of end on a nice light note. I love that there is this focus on joy. I love that it's a focus on, creating a culture of joy in the classroom, because, research shows that when educators create a joy-filled classroom, students are more likely to actually, learn. And it makes sense. If a student is happy being in that classroom, and they feel the care, right? And they feel that
yes.
belonging, they're going to be more excited to hear what that teacher has to say and to learn and to think of school as a positive experience.
Yes.
And I have so many students that I've worked with over the years who don't think about school as a positive experience, and they don't like it. They don't like being there. They don't like reading. They don't, they go there maybe for the social aspect of it.
Yep.
But as far as learning and actually enjoying the classroom, they don't like it. And so I love seeing the videos on Instagram and social media where educators are actually getting to know their students and creating that culture of, like, I see you. I see
Yes.
you, I hear you, I'm here for you. And this learning space is one that, you can feel safe. You can feel, um, you can be yourself. You can
Yes.
actually, exist and learn and be free. And
And that
again, yeah,
first.
go ahead.
Not adding that at the end, that comes first. Like, I want
Right.
to understand you set all of that up first and then you jump into pre-algebra. But what you're talking about is the foundation. It's not like a fun add-on. That's the first piece.
And that's such a great point, because that's one of the things when I bring on tutors to work with Gillis Education, we in that orientation, we talk about that. Like, we have to develop that relationship. And
Yes.
you're going to get so much more out of tutoring if you're able to connect to that student and develop that relationship. That's so important. And that has to be on the front end before we get to solving equations and before we get to phonics instruction. You really have to understand the student and their situation, and of course you get to know them over time, but making that very clear at the beginning that, hey, I'm here for you, like this is a safe space,
Right.
and this is a space where you can be yourself. And I want to talk about, we talked about it a little bit before, I want to talk about that poll. So for everyone who doesn't follow Deonna on, and actually, how can people follow you
Oh,
on
yeah.
Instagram? You have a great social media presence. How can people follow you?
Please join the community over at Deonna Smith, simple DEONNASMITH. And we have really good conversations. I love interacting with people. And it's just a really fun space to, hone your craft, bring a little levity to it, joke around a lot. But I also like to just kind of wear the hat of being a lifelong learner alongside of all y'all. So Deonna Smith on Instagram.
Great. And Deonna had a great question, and it's something that we've been talking about over the years, again, since this uh, DE&I efforts have, sprung up over the years. You put out a question to your followers, hey, if a student wants to be called certain pronouns that, may be different from how they look. So if Johnny, I'm just making this up, but if Johnny wants to be called, she, her, right? Or they, or, what have you. If they articulate that they want to be addressed a certain way, should the teacher or should the administrator talk to the parent first, or should they, just go along with what the student says? And I know when we talked about it before, I loved your response. I told you that I asked a few friends and family members and got responses all over the board, like from everything from, oh no, I'm going to call you what your mom named you, like, and that's point blank period, to, oh yeah, why would the parents need to know that? And so it is a complex issue, seemingly. What were your thoughts, and actually what sparked the poll?
Yeah. So it's funny. It's actually based on a true story. Because people know I'm a teacher, they come to me with their classroom problems a lot. And a friend of mine has a middle schooler. Middle schooler wants to be called a more gender neutral name and wants to use they them pronouns. And so the mom had called asking about their student, and the teacher's like, yeah, they, this and using the gender neutral name, and the mom is like, excuse me, like, what are you talking about? That's not my daughter, that's my daughter, etc. And she was just kind of like, say, she was, from a parent perspective, like, how could the school be doing this behind my back? You know what I mean? Like, why wouldn't they call me? And it was so interesting. And that's why I asked, because to me, in my head, the first thing I thought about, well, you don't want to out a student. So I personally have never outed a student. I would always advise people to think very clearly before outing a student, because I don't know the situation with my friend's child. But if that child is like exploring being non-binary or whatever's going on there, it's really not my role to out them, because there could be so many consequences. And I think as parents, our mindset is, that's my kid, that's my business. You know what I mean? Like, that child, I raised that child, it's my business. And I understand that and I respect that. But what's also true is that the teacher and the student have a sacred relationship. And the teacher, is a mandated reporter and is supposed to let you know if things are going that are dangerous to the child, right? It's supposed to keep you informed. But I would more like think about, invite people to reflect on, if something like that is happening, why didn't your child come to you first? To me, that's like the clearest thing. I'm like, well, and that's what I told my friend. I'm like, well, why do you think they didn't feel safe enough to talk to you about that? Like, what's going on that they feel safe telling their teacher that, but not you as their parent? So that's always my first thing, is like, reflect and step back before jumping in. But I got a lot of responses all over the board from people saying in their district, they have to refer to what the parents call them, like they have a policy, or to their district saying they're not allowed to. So it's kind of like what we've been talking about, where we are as a country. and I don't do a lot of, advice for parents because I'm not a parent, but what I usually do like to offer is at least kids are exploring their identity. They're exploring their racial identity. They're exploring their sexual orientation identity. And that is very normal. Why do you think we have so many coming of age movies? Like
Yeah.
adolescence is that exploratory time. But I think when it comes to gender and sexuality, because parents are parents, all of a sudden it gets really stressful and really uncomfortable and really difficult for people. But I've had kids that are just that's all they're doing. They're just experimenting. They don't know. Like, and if you notice, especially I've experienced this a lot because I work with black and brown kids more often than not. They're black and brown kids are doing the same thing. I have black kids that are figuring out how to be black, what that means. I have, Asian kids that hang out with the Latino kids and then they like want to be Latino, but then they struggle and they process, and that's what adolescence is. So it's very, very normal. So it's not unheard of. It's nothing to like panic about. You don't have to, if your child is communicating to you something about their sexuality, of course take it seriously. Don't minimize their experience. But I see a lot of parents that just fly off of the handle, like they're freaked out because they hear now she's going by they, and what does this all mean? And will I ever have grandkids? I'm like, chill out. They probably heard gender's not a binary on a TikTok video, and now they're going to try it on, and they might come to you and be like, never mind, or they might come to you and be like, actually, yeah, I kind of like this. So it's really nothing to panic about. And I think we owe it to kids, especially in our world that is so gray, to let them like live in the gray and be a little messy with it. And I always advise teachers, if that was my student, of course I would encourage my student to have a conversation with their family, as long as I knew that their safety wasn't, but if I like knew the parents and I knew the parents would be like chill with it, they were just a little scared, I would talk to them. Or I would, be like, hey, I think you should talk to your mom and dad if you got a chance to check in with us about that. So I think it isn't as dire and chaotic as I think it lands with people. But really it's about trust, because the first question that I always have in those scenarios is, it sounds like you and your kid need to talk more. Maybe you guys should have dinner at the dinner table a couple times a week until they feel comfortable enough to tell you about this, because it shouldn't be me. I should not be in it.
Exactly, exactly. No, this is great. And again, like having these conversations, normalizing these conversations is great. And that's why I appreciate, social media can be horrible, but social media is also a tool for us to actually have these conversations, for people like you to have polls out there to get the conversations going, and for everyone to share perspective. So I really appreciate you joining me today for this talk. This has been amazing. I've learned a lot just from hearing you talk about the work that you do. And again, in honor of Juneteenth, it is just so important that we make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion still on the forefront, still in people's minds, and that it is not being thwarted by certain political and social agendas. So I appreciate you coming and talking to us. This will be a podcast episode, so folks
Awesome.
can watch the replay on YouTube or on Facebook, and they can also listen to this podcast when it comes out. And so I'll make sure that, Deonna, you have the link so that your followers can reach it. And of course, my clients and students and tutors and consultants can also listen to it. There's a lot of great information that Deonna shared today. So again, thank you for joining me, and I can't wait for a part 2.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was so wonderful to chat with you, and I'm excited for part 2 anytime. Happy Juneteenth. I hope you and your family enjoy, do something joyful, restful, all the things.
Thank you. Same to you, and happy wedding planning. We'll talk
Oh,
about
thank
that
you.
soon too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.